I begrudgingly had to rebuild my crosscut sled in the shop this week, and I decided to film it. I had to rebuild it for a couple of reasons, but one of the main reasons is over the years it has gotten a lot of slop in the tracks. You could see how much it moves back and forth. The fence is no longer true or square, and I had used this for cutting angles at one point, so now I get a lot of tear out on there. So this design originally called for metal runners, and I cheaped out and used MDF, and that was one of my problems. In the wintertime, you could see I was adding shims to it because it was shrinking. In the summertime, it was getting too big and I was shimming it down, and over the years of all those adjustments, it eventually got out of square. So these are the original designs I used, so you can see the name and the website if you want to copy this one that I have. I'm going to be making a few changes to this design, making it a little bit more my own. The nice thing about having to remake jigs after you've been working in a shop for as long as I have is you kind of know what you need at this point and what you don't need, all the bells and whistles. The nice thing about crosscut sleds are you can make them as fancy. This one's pretty basic. There's some stuff I might add to it down the line, but it's pretty basic. But for people like myself, when I first started, I only had like a table saw and some hand tools for quite a while. You can do a lot with a crosscut sled. So this time around, I'm using better runners, and I have this Corian in the shop. It's basically just a resin plastic that they use for countertops. Years ago, I was still in my old shop. A guy that does counter installations asked me if I wanted some cut-off pieces. You might recognize this white one. I've put it on some jigs. I've used it ever since. I use it for any sort of situation where I don't have to worry a lot about moisture and humidity affecting components. Components I need to stay true over time. Because it's plastic, it's going to slide really nicely in these slots. So that is what I'm using. I just ripped them to fit in there. The only problem with this stuff, as you can see, it was 12 mil, so it's a little bit thicker than the slots, and I know a lot of people actually like to make this stuff slightly smaller so that the sawdust doesn't affect sliding it, which I'm not going to be able to do because ripping that plastic down is not an option. So all I do is where those grooves are going to be, I put little shallow 1/16 of an inch dados. It now sets on top of that plastic. I give myself some wiggle room for when I go to glue these on. I don't want them to be too perfect because you might have to shift it. And then you can see now it's going to slide in there. The plywood I'm using is just scrap I had around the shop. I happen to be working on a lot of cabinet projects, so I have quite a bit of pre-finished ply scraps. So that is what I'm using for the base and the fence. The fence, same thing. I had a bunch of 1/2 inch scrap. I didn't have enough 3/4 inch to do the fence, so I have to glue up more sheets than I normally would. I think I used 5 pieces of 1/2 inch. And since it's pre-finished, I had to sand the finish off first so the glue will stick. But just glued all that stuff together. I know some people like to use a level for this process. That's a great way to do it. It was something I forgot to do, but luckily mine turned out fine. The next day I could come and scrape the glue off of the table saw as well as one edge of my fence. Once I get enough of that glue off, I can then send it through the saw and clean up both edges. So the edge against the fence is the clean edge at this point, and I can just send it through, remove just a little bit of material. I'm only going about halfway through because it is quite a thick piece, and I could flip it upside down, send it through, and remove that one side. Once that side is clean, I can reference that side across against the fence. So basically flip it over and then clean up the other side, and then that is how I got the finished fence. You could see it against my table saw fence, which is very flat. There's no gaps or any big undulations, cups, or bows. And the final dimensions were 3.5, and then it was also thickness wise a little over 2 inches, so almost 2.5, and then it was about 45 inches long. My old one was 48, but I didn't have enough pieces of 48 to make it, and those measurements do not have to be perfect. I'm basically kind of copying them off of the original fence because that one did serve its purpose quite well. But if I'm shy 1/4 of an inch in thickness or 1/4 of an inch of height, it's not going to make a huge difference. So then for the top of this, I want to put 0 clearance inserts in it so I don't have to worry about messing up my crosscut sled if I want to use an angle. And there's been a lot of times I would love to use it to cut a dado, and I never did because it would really ruin the fence. And now I have that option. I'm also going to be throwing some T-track in the top as well. So for the zero clearance, what you just saw was I cut a little bit, and then I made sure that the 1/4 inch MDF I'm using fits in there perfectly. You really want it to be about the same height, as close to perfect of your crosscut sled. Otherwise wood will get hung up on it, either sink into it or hit the edge of it. And then I'm going to be putting 4 sections of T-track on there, which is basically replacing the T slots that I had in the old fence. It's just a faster, easier way to do it. T-track's not really cheap, but because I have it on almost all of the accessories in my shop, I have a lot of accessories that work with T-track. I know some people like to do other sorts of slots and use other sorts of stuff, but for what I have, it's easy to just put that track in there and use other things I have in there. So I put 4 just like the other one because I did use those 4 slots, especially on one side or the other. You usually want to have at least 2 spots where you're holding something down. I'm also going to put T-track on the fence. My old one had a piece of T-track on the fence. It's not there anymore because I pilfered it years ago for another jig in the shop, but I am going to add it to this one so I can have a stock block. Right now, whenever I have a need to cut something, I just clamp something to the fence, which works quite well, but stop blocks, I can either make one or buy one. They're not super expensive. So once I had the T-track and the zero clearance inserts cut for this, I could start putting it together. So I'm going to use my fence as my first reference point. It's not imperative that this all is square to the saw blade right now, but I do want it to be pretty close. The important part is getting the fence square to the saw blade. So I'm using the fence of the saw to get this as square as possible. And then I had epoxy on there because it will hold it, but I didn't trust it with the Corian. And I was sending some screws through lazily and snapped off the plastic in the back, which isn't that big of a deal because I'm going to trim it anyway. But to attach this to the fence, I didn't want to make that mistake again. You can see I countersunk my holes and then drilled holes that are actually bigger than my hardware. So the hardware is only going to grab into the ply. I don't have to worry about it breaking my plastic. So I used 1-inch screws for that, and then I could trim down my edges because I don't need them long. And honestly, this stuff is sturdy. It will last on here, but it is a little brittle. And then when I flipped it back over, it was tight in a couple spots. You could see where the Corian was picking up some of the metal markings from the tracks. So about 4 or 5 times I would slide it, and then I would take very lightly with the Dremel bit, just kind of clean up wherever those marks are, and then eventually I removed enough of my binding spots to get this to slide pretty easily. In my experience with stuff like this, there might be some tweaking the first week or so, but in general it's sliding pretty well. And then I could cut my zero clearance inserts. Like I said, this is 1/4 inch MDF. While I was doing all this, I found one of my old miter slots for this fence. I'm not planning on making a bunch of those because I don't make a lot of picture frames and whatnot, which is what people usually use those for, but they're easy to add to this if you want to. So before I cut this in half, I have to add my end piece because that is what holds everything together. And the end piece I had on this one was very simple. It was just a piece of hardwood. I had 2 screws in it. And I'm going to do the exact same thing. This piece is a little bit wider so it could kind of cut across all of my tracks. It's maple because that's what I had in the shop. I put 2 screws in it because that's really all you need. And sometimes there were times because the depth of this is a little under 2 feet, I would pop that off and cut bigger pieces with it. So I want that ability as well. Why I'm staring at this is because I screwed this onto the wrong side of the piece, so I had to flip it to the other side and then I could continue. The T-track, I just get whatever's cheapest on Amazon. I think this is the Power Tech company. Their stuff's not top of the line, but it's also not garbage, and it's easy enough to cut it in half on the miter saw. I thought I had 1/2 inch screws, but they're not. They're machine screws, so for right now this is just going to set in place. And then I could do my first curve cut. You'll notice the curve cut is cheated to one side of that groove, and that's because if I ever use this for data, which I will, it's going to take out quite a big chunk of everything to what is my right hand side of the blade, so that is why it's not perfectly centered. So I know some people have some fancy methods in order to get all this square, and I'm not knocking them, but in my experience, if you use a square, make sure you don't have the square against the carbide teeth of the saw. I have one screw on the right hand side, which will be my pivot screw, and then once everything's squared up, I could clamp it together on this one side. I have 2 screws in it at this point, and I'm going to test it. So the way I'm testing it is just cutting 2 scrap pieces of wood. The bigger the scraps, as in the depth, the more accurate it will be, but these are the 2 scraps I had. And then once I have these 2 cuts, I could put the 2 cut sides together, and if they mate perfectly, your crosscut fence is pretty square. So I know that that is not always the most accurate way to do it, but with what I had set up and a little bit of finagling, these 2 first cuts actually turned out pretty good. They mate almost perfectly in the middle. They mate against the fence without any large gaps. And when you take these off of the fence, the cut sides on a square are just about perfect as well. I did a couple more test cuts. This one up against the big light in my shop. There's no light shining through the gap. So for what I do and what I make, that is square enough for myself. I know some people like to really dial it in. There's other methods for that, but the square worked on this one. I was able to repurpose the handle from my old sled, which was kind of nice. It worked perfectly. I have no room for improvement in that area. And then I could go about and put my zero clearance in there. Like I said, I use MDF for this because MDF is going to be a true dimension. If I go by MDF a year from now, 1/4 inch, it's going to be the same dimension. Other lumbers are not always like that. You'll see I already noticed some things I have to change because the T-track that rides underneath this back part, I won't be able to get my slots in there, so I'll probably have to cut those shallow. But in general, this is what I'm working with. I am going to probably make a stop for it. I'm considering buying one because, like I said, people that watch the channel know I don't like making stuff like this. But we'll see. I will be adding that. And just for fun, I did the same test on my old sled, and you could see there's gaps against the fence, gaps against the piece, and this is basically it. So I made 2 zero clearance parts so that I could have one ready to go for the first time I cut an angle or the first time I cut a dado stack. But this is pretty basic, and the nice thing about this is you can then go and find other channels that will show you great attachments to make for this, and with the slots you can automatically add pretty much whatever you want to this. And my last bit of advice for beginners is to make a more basic sled like this with the ability to add pieces to it versus spending a lot of time and money making this elaborate jig to start with, because you're going to find, at least in my experiences, a lot of that stuff, there's other tools that are just going to do it better, and you won't end up using it, and then you have all these components kind of laying around the shop. You get a lot done with a simple jig like this, and as a project comes along and you need a specialized tool, add it to it.